Brilliant. So now our next speaker is joining us online, Tim Forsyth. He is Professor of Environment and Development at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Tim, welcome. Are you here with us?
Yes, I'm here now. Hi.
Yeah. Perfect. Yeah, we can hear you properly. Great stuff. So you're coming at it from an angle where you're working on the intersect, right, between science and how it integrates or not into decision-making processes, and then beyond, once decisions are taken, how that then integrates into society at large. So can you just tell us something about your perspective then on these issues between science and policy?
Thank you very much. Yes, as a social scientist working at the London School of Economics, I have been working for a long time on the interface between environmental change and policy. And Andres's excellent talk covered a great deal of things. What I'm going to focus on at the moment is the relationship of this concern with what he called the SPP, which is the Science Policy Panel, which has been proposed by the United Nations Environmental Assembly to talk about chemicals, waste, and pollution. Now, I'm going to go to a slide here, which I'm going to show. Okay, so the main point in just a few minutes is to say that whilst there is a huge concern about the pollution and the risks coming from chemicals, there's also a change happening in the way in which science policy panels try to address these changes. And I'm talking here about the possible design of the science policy panel on chemicals and what it might actually deal with and how it might be different from other panels, such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which is IPBES, which is another big science policy panel looking at biodiversity. So my main point is that assessments are changing, and the main transition is between what people call global environmental assessments towards solutions-oriented assessments. Now, the purpose of a global environmental assessment is to measure change. You know, in other words, is climate changing? Is there a problem? You know, what is going on? Towards the idea of, well, what do we do about it now? Which means more to do with addressing problems and identifying solutions. Now, the key point about that is that many of these science policy panels have been set up to generate knowledge which they call policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. In other words, they cannot be seen to be politically motivated, or else people will lose trust in the process of the science and the expertise, and therefore nobody will take any action. However, if we start moving towards solutions-oriented assessments, you have to start dealing with values and desires of different people. What sort of level of risk is appropriate? What sort of lifestyles do people want to live? Those sorts of questions, which therefore means that you have to get engaged with social values somewhere. And this is a deep challenge to the organizations like IPCC and IPBES, because they're not really designed to do that. They're full of a lot of scientists generating knowledge about is something happening or not, rather than the more social and political process of deciding which option to take. Now, this relates to the question of how to deal with the science policy panel, which in other words is expertise and participation. Now, the usual way, as Andres very well explained, and the speaker about the EU also explained, is that it's usually done through expert panels nominated from national member states. So you have this sort of national accountability towards an intergovernmental organization. The trouble with that is that that's a very good way of identifying experts on the underlying change, but it isn't necessarily in touch with the people experiencing the problems. What you have to do to engage with a more solution-oriented assessment is something to do with engaging with people who actually experience the risks. Now, this can be very different from the knowledge which already exists. So at the moment, as Andres correctly pointed out, there's a great deal of information about chemicals regulated at the national level or the international level. And that's great, but The knowledge which exists about chemical risks at the moment is largely generated by the industry in order to conform with those laws nationally or internationally. They do not come from people who are actually experiencing risks in different contexts. So, for example, in many of the developing countries where I've worked, there are many cases of chemical poisoning amongst people working in electronics factories, for example, where the chemical itself that they are inhaling isn't necessarily in itself so hazardous, because if it were, they wouldn't be using it. But rather it's to do with the context, the working environment under which they actually experience it. Like, how close are they to the equipment they are using? How many breaks do they take? What sort of ventilation is in the factory, and so on. Well, another problem is the use of chemicals like glyphosate in agriculture amongst relatively poor populations. So you often get pregnant women farmers poisoned by this, but it's not necessarily the chemical that is the problem, but rather the way in which the chemical is used. And that is where the sort of solutions and problems come, because it's not necessarily regulating the chemical, it's actually regulating the way in which the chemical is used. So that can often come down to the sort of distinction that the United Nations Environment Programme has made about the way in which a science policy panel for chemicals should be set up, which is this relationship between what they call the chemical up, or the essential properties of chemicals, which means you do expert assessment based upon the existing knowledge about regulations, about which chemical is hazardous and how, towards a more, what they call an impact or pollution down approach, which is more contextual, which means basically that you have to look at the places under which people experience hazards. Now, it's not an either or, it's a both and. But what I think I am saying, and what other people are saying, is that at the moment, the main generation of knowledge is much more geared towards the essential chemical up knowledge generated by the industry in order to abide by international regulations, rather than actually assessing how and why chemicals form problems for various people around the world in different places. Therefore, there has to be a greater involvement and participation with those people who are at risk in order to make the science policy panel useful and relevant for the people who are at risk. And this comes down to some of the things which Andres was talking about, like in the documentation for the science policy panel, they give a lot of attention to this word horizon scanning. Horizon scanning, I think, is simply the same as scoping. It basically means that the experts review the literature, they look at the regulations, they look at the information about chemicals, and they identify areas of hazard and risk, which they then write about and say, this is where the risk lies. However, this might still be too dependent upon an essentialistic chemicals up approach based upon existing knowledge about chemicals, rather than the sort of impact or pollution down approach based upon how people experience risk. There needs to be more attention given to that sort of area. So I'm wondering how far horizon scanning as a framework for the science policy panel needs to be added to by another framework, which we could call outcome harvesting, which is what a lot of people in debates about monitoring and learning and evaluation talk about, which is basically the idea that you don't simply study what you know already, but you go out there trying to find new things that you don't yet know about. And to do that, you've got to have a wider participation. And when I say wider participation, I mean bringing in different user groups to talk to us about their problems. So where does that leave us? The main point here is UNEP and the open-ended working group are trying to base the science policy panel on chemicals upon the IPCC and IPBES. My argument is that these are just old formats. They might have been a good reflection of thinking some 30 years ago, but they're not necessarily in touch with a new trend towards solutions-oriented assessments. There has to be a greater rethinking of what knowledge is necessary, how far that knowledge reflects different values of different people around the world, and also which structures allow those different people to actually influence the generation of knowledge. And at that point, I shall end. Thank you.
Great, thanks you so much. Thank you so much, Tim. So we have a little bit of time then for questions. So I'll also monitor online. So when I look at my phone, I'm monitoring questions online. Okay, I'm not sort of randomly checking messages. Okay, rest assured. So one thing that I would like to pick your brains on a little bit, Tim. You talked about how to go from policy relevant, and the solutions oriented aspect. But there's one thing that we see now is that science is being used much more directly as a justification for behavior change. Whereas normally what would happen somehow is that there's a regulation part in the middle. But now what you hear is phrases like, follow the science. Very simplistic phrases that, in my mind, bring science into the camp of political communication, which in other words could almost be something a bit like propaganda. When you hear follow the science, that sounds like very simplistic political communication with a very specific goal. And people in these kinds of issues related to environmental policy or safety, they feel that it's about behavior change, much more in a way than about regulating certain businesses or industries. And so science is being used as a tool to create behavior change. Do you see that as a positive development, or should behavior change be more about, policy building on scientific evidence potentially, but not directly using science as, an argument to say you should therefore change your behavior? I'd like to just pick your brains on that.
What an excellent question. Thank you very much. I think the reality is that for the last 30 years, we have had that model of science being used as behavior change. There are many organizations which have tried to do that, and many scientists who try to do that, not just activists like Greta Thunberg, for example, who might say, follow the science, right? It's not just the Greta Thunbergs of this world, it's also the Nobel Prize winning scientists who do this as well. And certainly also the IPCC, which, by the way, also won the Nobel Prize. So the whole idea of saying the science says this, therefore we must think about it, is, I think, an old format, which is increasingly part of how we do politics. The challenge, I would say, is not whether the science should feed the debate about behavior, but how do we make the science and how do we communicate the science towards the behavior? The problem we have is that on certain occasions, scientific consensuses don't necessarily last very long, or don't actually have much meaning towards the experience of problems as experienced by different people. So a very good example of that is the way in which the IPCC has changed since 1990, when it was mainly composed of meteorologists, towards the situation now when they have a whole host of different social analysts and physical analysts talking about a whole host of different things. And the main shift is this basic statement that atmospheric change isn't necessarily the experience of problems of people around the world. Yes, atmospheric change is happening and we need to be told to do something about that. However, simply being told that atmospheric change is happening isn't necessarily a guide to why people do things or don't do things. We have to do other things as well. So essentially, the answer to your question is yes, I think science should be used as a way to educate people about how to change. However, science also needs to change to become more sensitive to how people actually experience environmental change as a problem. And I think it's an ongoing process.
And it comes back to this question of independence. I'll just take one question online, and then I'll give you the floor, because it's about this independence issue. There's a question saying, the UK government is actually very keen to ensure that industry is part of the science policy panels. What kind of role do you see for industry actually in these panels, Tim?
I think industry has got a huge, important role to play. However, industry is not the only actor. And of course, there are different types of industry. I mean, a good parallel debate here are the things which are called roundtables. So in the last 10, 15 years, we've got the roundtable on sustainable palm oil, the roundtable on sustainable soy, and now there's a roundtable on sustainable beef. These are supposed to include industry, government, NGOs, local citizens, all coming around to talk about how to find solutions. The experience so far is that they're very good at finding solutions to technical matters, but not necessarily to social or political matters. So they're very good at talking about how much glyphosate should be used in producing soy, but they're not very good at talking about things like labor rights on soy plantations or whatever, those sorts of things. And I think, there has to be an involvement of industry, but it's not just industry.
Okay, thank you. So we have a question.
Hi, Tim. Thanks a lot for that interesting intervention. My name is Jane Munke. I'm a scientist working on the evidence base of chemicals, hazardous chemicals in food contact materials. And I'm intrigued by your call for more solutions-oriented assessments. As an environmental scientist, I know that problems oftentimes can be very complex. But if we speak about solutions, in my mind, that kind of suggests that we've understood what the problems actually are that we're dealing with. So my question to you is, how do we avoid coming up with solutions that become tomorrow's problems?
Yeah, especially when you've contextualized them in very specific scenarios, Tim, just to make it even more complex. So, yeah.
Thank you for your excellent question. Well, the answer to your question, how can we find solutions which don't end up as tomorrow's problems, lies in what academics will call a reflexive process, which basically means an ability to propose solutions, test them, evaluate them, and then change them if necessary. And part of that process of evaluation and learning depends upon getting in touch with the people who experience tomorrow's problems. And hopefully you have that sort of deliberative, reflexive process of learning and advancing your knowledge. You never reach a perfect state. You're constantly looking to improve. However, I would like to make this additional point, which is that I don't think what I have called the solutions-oriented assessment is the only way to deal with problems, because the old approach of global environmental assessments were also trying to deal with problems, but in ways which I think encountered the problem that you've just described. The example I gave before, I think, is a good one, which is that if we were to go back to 1997, the Kyoto Protocol for climate change, the implication of all that was the sooner we get rid of the gases, the sooner we get rid of the problem, right? And I think what we learned is that simply getting rid of gases doesn't necessarily get rid of the vulnerability that makes gases a problem, but also fast ways to get rid of gases can also increase the problems. So there were many cases of carbon offset forestry, for example, which diminished the rights of people who lived in the countries where the trees were planted. They also had additional problems that many tree plantations reduce biodiversity or impact negatively on hydrology and so on. Now, that doesn't mean to say that all forms of forestry are bad, of course not. But what it does mean is that the older approaches of a sort of a scientific model of the problem separate from human experience often led to proposed solutions which didn't actually address people's problems and became the problems that we experience today. So what we are trying to do with a solutions-oriented approach is to try and connect the knowledge generation much more closely to the actual experience of problems in order to avoid the sort of things that you're talking about.
Okay, brilliant. We have a question at the back. Yep.
Yes. So I'm Terry Collins. I direct the Institute for Green Science at Carnegie Mellon University. I've been working for over 30 years trying to teach the interface of chemistry and sustainability. And I really think that our problems are mostly sociological. And when you say we're going to have a major input from industry, as I'm not saying we shouldn't, on the SPP, part of the problem is that therefore means that there'll be a major voice for money first on that panel. And how do we get a major voice for sustainability first on the panel? And to capture this very briefly, money first in the chemical industry is about developing products based on technical and cost performance only. Sustainability is about integrating health, environment, and fairness performances with cost and technical performances into the value proposition. And unless we are able to get this other dimension in there, we are largely going to deal with an incompetent SPP for sustainability. So if you would comment on that, I'd be very grateful.
You're asking me to comment, yeah? I think many people could comment on that. Terry, that's a really interesting and important question. It can often come down to personal opinions. Okay, my personal opinion is that a lot of chemicals are made by industry and they're used and disseminated by industry. Therefore, we have to involve industry in them. We also shouldn't talk about industry as a single block. I think there's different types of industry, different companies which might seek profit by short-term actions versus long-term companies with long-term horizons. And usually those long-term horizons companies want to have regulation because it suits them. It plays to their game. They want to have a regulated environment, which means that they can get good at what they do and they can exclude all the free riders who want to break the rules. That's the idea. So I wouldn't generalize myself to say that if business is involved, it means money first. I think we have to acknowledge that as things stand, the generation of profits and is part of the driving thing behind the manufacturing and dissemination of chemicals. So we must involve that sector in finding a sustainable solution, but they have to work towards a sustainable solution. They can't just simply oppose it all the time. I don't think all companies are opposing it all the time, and I would try to find a process which gives more space to the more responsible type of producer, rather than treat all businesses as negative towards the process. That's my view. I think other people would have different views.
Just a brief comment, Tim. I mean, I would totally agree with that. But the other side to the question is, where does the competence for health, environment, and fairness performances come from that's going to be there to balance technical and cost, or an emphasis on technical cost? Where do you see that competence coming from? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm guessing it's like I said about the roundtables, which is that you have representatives of those things, which I guess would be organizations like UNEP, other organizations. There's an organization in India, Toxics Watch, for example, NGOs, activists, civil society organizations, scientific experts, those health officials. Ideally, the structure should involve all those actors in a sort of cumulative way.
Okay, and we have one more question then, just because it relates back to what you were saying around horizon scanning and this move towards understanding impacts and not necessarily only focusing on the analysis of the chemicals themselves, right? And so the question is, people are proposing that we should move from a compound-based assessment to an impact-based risk assessment to cope with mixtures. So when you talk about horizon scanning, are you covering that? Or do you think basically we should be looking at, real world exposure cases only, that this is what should be informing policy?
No, it's both and. But what's the problem at the moment, though, is that it's not clear. I mean, what we have was a decision by the United Nations Environment Assembly to create the panel. They have created an open-ended working group. The open-ended working group has produced various documents which talk about these things, which is great. But as it stands, the documents are not very clear about what does horizon scanning actually mean. I would say, of course, there has to be a compound-based essential approach to what is risky about a chemical. But I don't think it's enough. It's necessary but insufficient. You also have to have a greater understanding of how and why and when those chemicals become hazardous to other people. I think that those are the blind spots, and often these blind spots reflect social structures. Like I mentioned my example of pregnant women farmers in Colombia, for example, where they're spraying chemicals on their crops, and they're dying, or they're having miscarriages, and those people are not a large voice in international negotiations. Somehow we have to get in touch with the risks experienced by people who don't have that voice. And I think that has to come from something more than just the analysis of compounds, although the analysis of compounds is essential.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tim, for having shared these insights. These are important thoughts for, I think, everyone here working at this intersect between, science and policy and more general communication to the public. And so I kind of realize I have this kind of UFO above my head ready to suck me up as we're about to go to lunch. So thanks a lot, Tim. I'll close this morning session before I get sucked up by the UFO. You have